What if the single biggest mistake in retirement is not spending too much, but spending your best years in a fear that was never mathematically justified? That is not a motivational line. That is what the data actually shows, and almost nobody talks about it. Here is what I have seen over and over again. People who did everything right. People who saved steadily, stayed disciplined, did not panic when markets dropped, lived below their means for decades, and still cannot shake that one question sitting at the back of their mind every single morning. What if it is not enough? That fear is not random. It was built into the system. Year after year, projection after projection, the same language, the same framing, the same quiet suggestion that the job of retirement is to not run out before you die. And once you absorb that framing, it starts rewiring behavior. The trip you wanted to take gets pushed back. The renovation you planned gets shelved. The dinners out become maybe next month. Not because the numbers demand it, because the fear has become the compass. Look at what that actually costs over time, not just in dollars, in years lived smaller than necessary. So here is the question worth sitting with before anything else. What if the real leak in your financial future is not inflation, not a bad market cycle, not even a miscalculation, but a structure hiding inside accounts that look perfectly normal and professional and responsible on the surface? This is personal finance and investing, but not the kind built around generic rules designed for the average person who never existed. I am going to show you why two specific structural decisions can separate two people with nearly identical savings into completely different retirements, and why the financial industry has very little incentive to explain this clearly. One decision is about where your money lives. The other is about how you take it out. Together, they can produce a gap large enough to change not just a portfolio balance, but the actual texture of your daily life in the years you spent 4 decades building toward. Before you move on, do one thing right now. Pull out your phone, open the calculator, write down the total balance across every retirement account you own today. Not a projection, not a goal. The actual number sitting there right now. Because by the time this is over, you are going to see that number differently. You are going to understand where silent friction is working against it. You are going to see why the plan that looks safest can sometimes be the one extracting the most from you. The people who follow standard advice are not doing anything wrong. They are doing exactly what they were trained to do. They are just missing two things that nobody in that system benefits from explaining. That is what this is about. Not theory, not a pitch. The structural difference between a retirement that quietly shrinks and one that quietly grows. And the strangest part? The people who end up with the best outcomes are almost never the ones who took the biggest risks. They are the ones who understood how the machinery worked. So stay with this, because what comes next is the part that most financial conversations skip entirely. Marcus did not expect retirement to feel this unsettling. After 38 years as a civil engineer in Columbus, Ohio, he expected the silence of the first free morning to feel like relief. Instead, it felt like pressure wearing at the skies. No commute, no inbox, no performance review waiting down the hall. Just a kitchen table, a mug of coffee going cold, and a low-grade worry that suddenly had no schedule to hide behind. He and his wife Carol had played the long game. They had paid off the house in their mid-50s. They had stayed out of consumer debt. They had kept contributing to the 401k, even during the years when the market felt like it was specifically designed to test their patience. On paper, Marcus looked fine. A little over $600,000 spread across a 401k, a traditional IRA, and a taxable brokerage account. Not wealthy, famous money, but enough to believe the hard work had landed somewhere solid. Then the paycheck stopped, and something strange happened to the exact same number he had spent decades accumulating. It stopped feeling like evidence of success. It started feeling like a timer. So he did what most careful Americans do. He called an advisor. The office was clean and calm. The advisor was polished, reassuring, and backed by software that could turn a human life into a projection graph in under 3 minutes. The projection looked measured. The conversation felt responsible. But the message underneath it was unmistakable. If Marcus kept spending controlled, the money should last into his early 80s. Should last. He drove home with that phrase on repeat. Not thrive, not adapt, not support the life he had built. Should last. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and listed every regular expense he could name. Groceries, car insurance, utilities, gas, property tax, healthcare premiums, prescription costs, emergency repairs. Nothing on the list looked reckless, but nothing felt comfortable either. And Marcus was not an unusual case. That is the first thing worth understanding. Across the country, people retire with meaningful balances and carry the exact same invisible tension. Because statements show totals, but rarely show what the structure beneath those totals is actually doing over time. Sandra, a retired school principal, felt it too. She had trusted the same mutual funds for over a decade, never questioned the arrangement, and told herself the quarterly calls were enough. The statements looked clean, but nobody had ever shown her what was being quietly extracted from that clean-looking portfolio every single year. Robert showed the pattern even more directly. He started cutting back before his situation required it. Fewer flights, fewer celebrations, a cautious, reduced version of the life he had spent 40 years trying to reach. That is how the leak begins. Not with a dramatic collapse, with disciplined people making themselves smaller because the system trained them to fear running out far more than it ever trained them to understand how money actually behaves over long time horizons. The scale of this is worth sitting with. It is not one careless investor making one bad call. It is millions of careful savers following default templates and mistaking inherited caution for actual control. Marcus only knew one thing leaving that advisor's office. The math looked official, but the life it described felt like a significant underestimate of everything he had actually built. What he could not yet see was exactly where the damage was coming from. The leak had started years before he retired, and the most expensive part of it had never once appeared on a statement. 3 days after the meeting, Marcus did something most people never think to do. He stopped asking whether the projection was frightening. He started asking what the projection was assuming. That shift sounds small. It is not. Fear hands you a finished story. Numbers, if you actually read them, start showing you the edits. The first thing that bothered him was almost too obvious. The plan modeled retirement as a managed decline, a steady, responsible descent from $600,000 towards zero at an acceptable pace. As if the entire job of a portfolio was to disappear gracefully. Marcus had spent nearly 4 decades around engineered systems, and the one thing systems taught him is that when an output looks too clean, the problem is usually buried in the assumptions, not the math. So he pulled the statements again. He looked at the expected return assumptions. He looked at the withdrawal rate. He looked at how the accounts were grouped. And there it was. The accounts were treated as if they were interchangeable, as if $1 in a taxable brokerage behaved the same way as $1 in a Roth IRA, as if placement did not matter, as if the IRS did not distinguish between different types of income sitting in different types of accounts. That was the contradiction. The model looked precise, but its precision was built on a simplification that quietly cost real money every single year. A fee that seems harmless in year 1 does not stay harmless when it repeats for 25 years. Bond interest taxed at ordinary rates in the wrong account does not stay a rounding error when it compounds across decades. A spending rule designed for historical catastrophe does not become responsible just because it got repeated enough times to sound like wisdom. The more he read, the sharper the picture became. People were constantly instructed to focus on how much they had accumulated. Almost nobody slowed down long enough to explain where those assets lived, what they were costing in fees and taxes, and how those invisible subtractions were quietly rewriting the final number. Then he found the pattern that changed the tone of everything. The damage was not coming from one reckless move. It was coming from several reasonable-looking decisions, each one respectable on its own, stacked quietly on top of one another. Actively managed funds with higher expense ratios. An advisory fee applied to the entire portfolio every single year. Bond income sitting in taxable space. Long-growth assets parked where their upside could not fully compound. Tax events triggered earlier than necessary. None of it looked alarming in isolation. That is exactly what made it so effective. The leak did not arrive like a warning. It arrived wearing the same uniform as every professional, responsible financial decision Marcus had ever made. Clean language, calm offices, quarterly calls that felt reassuring enough that nobody asked harder questions. He wrote 2 words on the corner of the legal pad: invisible friction. Not market failure, not bad luck, not personal incompetence. Just structural resistance, small and quiet, repeated so many times it had already changed the destination before retirement even began. And that realization opened a door. If structure could silently damage an outcome, then structure could deliberately repair one. If the machinery had been working against him, then understanding the machinery could start working for him. He stopped seeing retirement as a pile of savings with a slow leak. He started seeing it as a system. And one question arrived that he could not avoid. If 2 people can save similar amounts, invest through the same markets, retire in the same decade, and still end up in completely different places, what exactly is doing the separating? The answer was not talent. It was not luck. It was not even effort. It was arrangement. And what that meant in actual dollars was about to become very difficult to look away from. Marcus went back to the advisor's office. But this time, he was not there for reassurance. He came with a list. Expense ratios, management fees, account-by-account tax treatment, withdrawal assumptions, everything underneath the polished projection. The advisor pulled the reports, and for the first time, the mystery stopped being emotional and became measurable. A meaningful portion of Marcus's portfolio sat in actively managed funds. They looked sophisticated. They came with familiar brand names. They had professional-sounding descriptions in the quarterly statements, and they were costing him significantly more than the broad index alternative every single year, with no consistent evidence of better performance to justify the difference. Then came the second layer, the advisory fee itself. Not charged on gains, charged on the entire portfolio, in up years and down years alike. Marcus had never experienced this as pain because it never arrived as a single visible bill. It arrived in silence, trimmed quietly year after year, inside the same paperwork that looked like good stewardship. But the number that genuinely stopped him was the third one. Some of his bond funds were sitting in taxable space. The interest they generated was being taxed at his ordinary income rate. Meanwhile, several of his long-growth equity holdings were positioned in accounts where their compounding advantage was being partially neutralized. Nobody had described the portfolio as poorly built, and technically it was not, but it was arranged in a way that created friction at every layer before compounding ever had a clean chance to work. Once the sources of drag were isolated, the revised picture was no longer theoretical. Replacing the most expensive funds with low-cost broad index alternatives would reduce annual drag immediately. Repositioning assets by tax character, placing income-heavy holdings in sheltered accounts and growth-oriented holdings in tax-advantaged space would reduce ongoing tax costs without requiring any prediction about the market. Marcus ran the revised projection twice because he did not trust what the first version showed him. It did not look like a fantasy. It looked logical. That was somehow the most unsettling part. The same savings, organized with less friction, gave the portfolio more room to absorb difficult years, more room to recover, and more room to keep compounding, even while withdrawals were running. That was the moment the psychology broke open. Retirement stopped being a bucket slowly draining toward zero. It became a system that could be deliberately tuned. But the hardest realization was not about money. It was about time already spent under the wrong story. Marcus had already started negotiating against his own future. He had mentally pre-approved a smaller version of his retirement months before the math actually required it. Not because the numbers demanded caution, because the template had framed caution as the only respectable posture. That framing had a cost, and the cost was measured in choices already given up before they were ever actually threatened. So he made 3 concrete moves. He exited the highest cost funds. He reorganized his account structure around tax efficiency rather than visual symmetry. He stopped accepting any projection until he understood the assumptions that built it. None of that eliminated risk. Markets could still drop. Inflation could still accelerate. Health costs, bad timing, or unexpected family needs could still reshape everything. But now he was responding to actual variables instead of inherited fear. And that left one final question hanging in the room. If fixing the structure alone could close that much of the gap, what would happen if the spending side of the equation was redesigned with the same level of honesty? Because that shift would not just change the number at the end of 30 years. It would change what retirement was actually for. Not because risk disappears, because you finally understand what you are actually dealing with. The breakthrough here is not a brilliant market call. It is not a proprietary system. It is the moment you realize that better outcomes usually come from eliminating friction before you spend a decade chasing higher returns. So here is how to actually do this. Step 1. Find the drag. Pull every account statement you own. Write down every expense ratio, every advisory fee, every fund cost, and every recurring tax impact you can identify. Do not estimate. Find the actual numbers. A strategy that works here is treating this like an audit of your own operating costs. If you cannot name where the money is leaking, you cannot fix the leak. Step 2. Stop treating your accounts like identical containers. A taxable brokerage account, a traditional 401k or IRA, and a Roth IRA are not interchangeable. They have different tax rules, different timing implications, and different long-term behaviors. The error that many people make here is organizing all 3 to look visually balanced rather than structurally intelligent. Each account has a distinct job. Once you match the right assets to the right account, the portfolio starts working with the tax code instead of against it. Step 3. Position assets by tax character, not by habit. Income-heavy assets like bond funds and REITs generate interest that the IRS taxes at your ordinary income rate. Those belong inside tax-sheltered accounts, where that income can compound without an annual tax cut. Long-growth equity assets, particularly broad index funds and small-cap holdings with the highest expected long-term return, belong in your Roth or tax-advantaged space, where that growth can eventually come out without a tax bill attached. Step 4. Interrogate the withdrawal rule you inherited. A spending guideline built to survive the worst economic periods in recorded American history is not the same as the right spending rate for your specific life. A strategy that works here is mapping your actual income sources, your real expenses, your flexibility, and your health before deciding how much to take from the portfolio each year. Social Security income, part-time work, and other sources fundamentally change the math. Your plan should reflect your real situation, not a template designed for a worst-case scenario that statistically applies to a very small percentage of retirements. Now do something concrete. Take your total portfolio balance. Multiply it by 1%. Then multiply it by 2%. Those numbers are the zone where invisible friction may already be quietly reshaping your future. Percentages feel abstract. Dollar figures do not. That is the exercise that tends to change how seriously people take this. Here is the deeper point underneath all of it. You are not trying to become fearless about money. You are trying to become precise. Precise about what things actually cost. Precise about which accounts carry which assets. Precise about what your money is supposed to do for your life, not just for a spreadsheet. And the plot twist most people miss. The goal is not to die with the most money. The goal is to stop living as if financial collapse is always one quarter away. A well-structured retirement should create safety, but it should also create permission. Permission to travel. Permission to support your family. Permission to spend with judgment instead of anxiety. So the reset comes down to this. Audit fees. Reposition assets by tax character. Review withdrawal assumptions against your real life. Keep 12 months of cash needs liquid and accessible. Then let the rest of the structure do what it was designed to do. One last reminder before moving on. This is financial education, not a direct recommendation to buy or sell any specific investment. The point is to understand the structure well enough to ask sharper questions and make decisions based on your actual situation. And the hardest question to answer honestly, is this next financial decision protecting your future or just protecting your fear? That distinction is where the real work begins. Marcus did not wake up the next morning as a different person. The market did not reward him overnight for finally understanding the structure. The world did not step aside and remove the uncertainty that comes with living on a portfolio for 30 years. What changed was quieter than that. He stopped looking at retirement as a countdown toward zero. He started looking at it as a system he could read, adjust, and actually use. That sounds like a small shift. It is not. Because when people do not understand the structure underneath their money, they make decisions based on the feeling of the structure rather than the reality of it. And the feeling, shaped by projections built for catastrophe and language borrowed from scarcity, almost always pushes toward unnecessary caution. The trip gets delayed. The choice gets smaller. The life that was supposed to open up quietly gets edited down instead. That was never required. It was inherited. Now Marcus had a language for what had been happening. Fees were not harmless background costs. Taxes were not neutral. Account placement was not cosmetic. The spending rule was not sacred. And most importantly, fear was not the same thing as financial responsibility. So here is the practical recap, clearly and completely. The first thing that changes outcomes is understanding and eliminating fee drag. A 1.5 to 2% annual cost applied to the entire portfolio year after year, compounding silently against the base, is one of the most significant and most invisible forces in long-term retirement math. Replacing high-cost, actively managed funds with broad, low-cost index alternatives is the single most accessible structural improvement most people can make immediately. The second thing that changes outcomes is asset location. Not asset allocation, which is about percentages across asset classes. Asset location is about which accounts those asset classes live inside. Income-producing assets belong in tax-sheltered space. High-growth assets belong in tax-advantaged space. That reorganization does not require predicting the market. It requires understanding the tax character of what you already own. The third thing that changes outcomes is an honest withdrawal strategy. A rule built for survival through historical disasters is not automatically the right default for a retirement that includes Social Security income, some spending flexibility, and health that allows for adjustment. Your withdrawal rate should fit your actual life, not a worst-case template. And here is the step-by-step that puts this into motion. First, sit down with every account statement you own. Not next week, this week. Second, list the fee and expense ratio on every single fund. Then calculate what that costs in actual dollars per year. Third, identify whether your income-producing assets and your growth assets are in the right accounts. Fourth, review your withdrawal plan and ask whether it was built for your life or inherited from a standard template. Fifth, calculate 12 months of essential expenses and make sure that amount is accessible and protected. Then let the rest of the structure do its job. The error that many people make here is treating this as a one-time audit. It is not. This is a living structure that needs to be reviewed as life changes, as tax laws change, and as the portfolio itself evolves. The expected result of doing this correctly is not a magic number. It is a retirement that operates the way it was always designed to, one where the plan reflects your actual situation rather than a generic projection built around fear. And one mystery still sits open. If so many people save faithfully, follow the rules, stay disciplined, and still arrive at retirement with this invisible drag running silently against them, what started it? Part of the answer is structure. Part of it is language, the words used in financial conversations that normalize templates and discourage hard questions. But part of it begins much earlier, in the earning years. In the decade before retirement, when small habits, small fee choices, and small structural decisions are compounding quietly in one direction or another. That is the next layer of the story. Because retirement is almost never built at retirement. It is built 10 to 15 years before, in choices that barely registered at the time. Take 1 hour this week and face your actual numbers. Write down what you find. Challenge anything vague. Look for the drag. Look for the misaligned accounts. Look for the places where an inherited assumption may be silently costing more than any market risk ever has. Thanks for sticking with me this far. Like the video if you want me to keep exploring these concepts in depth. Every like tells me it's worth digging deeper. If this content has opened your eyes to a new way of looking at finances, do one thing right now. Leave a comment saying which part impacted you the most. Not for the sake of engagement, but because writing clarifies your thoughts. And clarity is the first real asset you can build today at no cost. See you next time.